Peter Singer was born in Melbourne, Australia in 1946, and he was educated there and at the University of Oxford. By 1999, he became the Ira W. de Camp Professor of Bioethics at Princeton University. He wrote the book Animal Liberation in 1975, in which he argues for vegetarianism and the rights of all animals, especially factory farm animals. Now, journalists have bestowed upon Dr. Singer the tag of world's most influential living philosopher. And this is due largely to his work on the ethics of the treatment of animals. And he's been credited as being somewhat of the godfather of the animal rights movement back in the 70s. Singer's thoughts have played a significant role in the effective altruism movement. He suggests that it's not just about reducing suffering, but doing so in the most efficient way possible. Peter Singer's latest book is called The Buddhist and the Ethicist. Here he teams up with a Taiwanese Buddhist monastic social activist named Shi Chao-hui, and they join forces to talk ethics and lively conversations that cross oceans, overcome language barriers, and bridge philosophies. Dr. Singer now only teaches at Princeton in the fall semester. He spends part of each year doing research and writing in Melbourne so that he and his wife Renata can spend time with their 3 daughters and 4 grandchildren. And I also found out recently that Dr. Singer likes to hike and to surf. So, catch a wave and you're sitting on top of the world, Dr. Singer. Very impressive. So now let's consider what Dr. Singer thinks about the rights of animals and artificial intelligence. Welcome, Peter Singer, to All Things Considered. It's a pleasure to meet you, sir.
Thank you, Christopher. It's good to be with you as well.
Thank you. Listen, we're going to talk a bit about animal liberation now first, and we'll talk a little bit about artificial intelligence. In the preface to the book, you state ending factory farming would bring environmental benefits, cleaning up our polluted rivers, improving the air many rural people breathe, and dramatically reducing deaths from heart disease and cancers of our digestive system. Now, for our viewers and listeners, would you mind expanding on how this might happen?
Well, certainly. So obviously in animal liberation now, I'm concerned about the suffering of animals. And so I'm concerned about the fact that there are something like 9 billion factory farmed animals in the United States alone, globally. And especially if that's land animals, especially if you include fish farming, which is also very intensive, sort of factory farming underwater, you actually get up to about 200 billion animals a year. So it's a vast number of animals that we're doing this to. In terms of the environment, then what you have to think about is that we have taken these animals away from the fields where some of them anyway would be gathering their own food. And instead we've put them inside huge sheds, or other forms of confinement in the case of cattle. And so we have to grow the food and feed it to them. So firstly, that's a very wasteful process, because just by living and breathing and keeping their bodies warm, the animals have to burn up a lot of the food value of what we feed them. So we have to produce much more food than we need to sustain ourselves. And that means that we have to farm more intensively in arable land, and also that places like the Amazon are getting cleared to grow food for these animals, or in some cases for grazing animals. But something like 40% of the Brazilian Amazon is being cleared to 40% of the clearing of the Brazilian Amazon, I should say, is to grow soy, and something like 70 to 80% of the world's soy crop is fed to animals. So if we didn't have all these animals, we would have a much better buffer of food supplies for humans for when we need it. We would have less pressure on land. We would not be clearing so much of the Amazon, which of course is disastrous for climate change. And in addition, by having fewer animals and especially fewer cattle, there would be a lot less methane put into the atmosphere, because cattle and sheep are major emitters of methane, and that's an extremely intensive greenhouse gas. Depending on the timescale, if you talk about the next 20 years, which is really when we need to get to net zero to avert climate catastrophe, methane is something like 82 times as powerful as carbon dioxide. So there's a lot of benefit for the climate if we stopped intensively raising animals. You asked, local rivers, I mentioned in that quote. A lot of these factory farms have a manure in what they call a lagoon, which is basically a huge cesspool somewhere near the farm. And eventually they empty that or pump it out and put it on fields. But a lot of it gets into local rivers. Sometimes when there's heavy rain, it floods. Sometimes it washes off the fields into rivers. And there's a lot of rivers that are just overnourished, polluted with manure. And many older people will say, oh yeah, when I was a kid, we used to swim in that river, but you wouldn't go near it now. Right. So that's part of it. Air pollution, if you know anybody who lives downwind of a factory farm, they absolutely stink. So that's where the part of the air pollution is coming from. So there's a lot, and then there's the health and diseases, right? So the Lancet, which is one of the world's top 2 medical journals, set up a commission called the Eat Lancet Commission, consisting of doctors as well as environmental scientists. And they warned that both for the health of the planet and for our individual health, we should be cutting out red meat and processed meat. We should be eating less meat and fewer animal products in general, less dairy, because that also is clogging up our arteries and is not good for the planet. And then they're not saying go vegan. They're saying you can eat small amounts of animal products, of chicken and fish, which I wouldn't eat for other reasons, but for your health maybe it's not so harmful. But drastically reduce the amount of animal products, and so we could do that and cut back a lot on factory farming, and reduce those deaths from diseases of the digestive system and heart disease.
Right. Right. Well, thank you for that clarification, sir. You provide Bentham's thought-provoking query. The question is not, can they reason nor can they talk, but can they suffer? The capacity for suffering or enjoyment plays very largely in your ethical framework. Are other factors involved in this capacity, like the ability, say, to consciously know the degree of severity or benefit of such actions? Is there a spectrum, real or imagined, that could depict the range and importance of those types of feelings, or are they important at all? Do they matter?
Well, I do think that Bentham is right to say that the crucial question is, can they suffer? Can a being suffer, or can it enjoy its life, feel pleasure? Once a being can do that, I think it has a basic moral status. And that basic moral status entitles it to equal consideration of whatever interest it has. Now, its interest may not be the same as ours, obviously. So humans have an interest in being literate, getting an education. Without that, we can't function very well in the world. Animals do function in the world without that, so they don't have an interest in that. They couldn't do it anyway. But when we're talking about things like pain or suffering, I think we should try to say, how much is this hurting the animal? Is it comparable to what it would hurt a human? If it is, I should give it just the same weight. It's just as important. But maybe there's some kinds of suffering, anxiety, worrying about what might happen in some future date, which humans particularly feel, and non-human animals don't. Or again, it might vary with the species, but many non-human animals might not, anticipate bad things happening if they're not really quite immediate and quite a present danger. So yeah, we may have different interests and different forms of suffering, and they may in some cases take priority over the animals. In some cases, the animals might take priority over us. You asked about sort of other cognitive capacities, like thinking about ourselves as an individual, thinking about the fact that we've lived before and hope to live in future. That can make a difference, I think, to how we should treat beings. Perhaps it makes a difference to the wrongness of killing a being, because we live in this sense in which we live a biographical life. So we are thinking about what happened to us in the past. We have hopes for the future, and to improve our chances of fulfilling those hopes, we do a lot of things now that we wouldn't do otherwise. And most non-human animals don't do that, or not to the same extent. So maybe killing us cuts off that biography, makes useless the things that we've been doing for the future, and of course has an effect on others who love and care for us. And some of that will apply to non-human animals, and maybe some of it won't. So that might make for differences in the seriousness of the death, the unexpected death, or the killing of a normal human, that it wouldn't make for a non-human animal.
Right, right. Now, you mentioned the work of Penn State biology professor Victoria Braithwaite. She investigates the capacity for fish to feel pain. I found this really interesting in the book. I come from a long line of fishermen, and my son Matt today works in a fishing store. For years, I philosophically considered the ethics of sport fishing versus fishing for consumption. And I haven't sport fished for years. But the research from Braithwaite suggests that my intuitions were correct. That is to say, fish really don't like being caught, even to be let go again. Do you think if more sports fishermen were aware of this, there might be less tournaments celebrating this capacity, this ability?
I think there might be, yes.
Yeah.
Because, you know, in a way, sports fishing is certainly causing distress to fish, and it's just a sport, right? So we Canadians, Americans, Australians, whatever group we're talking to here, most English-speaking people in the world, you know, reject bullfighting because we say, well, it's just entertainment, right? They're inflicting suffering on the bull just for the entertainment of doing it. But that's what sport fishing is too, just that we don't relate to the animal in quite the same way, because, you know, fish, well, if they're silent for one thing, they're not mammals, they're not warm-blooded. We think of them as somehow cold and slimy, and many people sort of question whether they can feel pain. But I think Victoria Braithwaite's work settles that, and there's been other research as well, that they do feel pain, that they feel pain in some ways similar to us. And it's not only physical pain. She certainly shows that, for example, that their lips, which of course are pierced by the hook in fishing, that their lips are very sensitive.
Yeah, you talk about nociceptors?
Yeah, that's right. There are nociceptors there, the pain, things that relay pain to the brain.
Right.
But it's not only that. Fish also try, you know, depending on the species, obviously, they will try to get something that they want, even if there is some pain involved, but only up to a certain point. So one of the experiments is with a fish that is the kind of species that has a companion. So it's fish that pair up in the way that birds say often do, and we humans do. If you separate a fish from its companion and you create some barrier, maybe a part of the water where there's an electric shock going through, if the shock is low enough, the fish will still cross the barrier to get to the companion. If the shock is very high, the fish won't cross the barrier. Right. So the fish is obviously feeling the pain, wanting to get to the companion, and in some distress of being separated from the companion. As again, you know, we might well be in similar circumstances.
Yeah,
our mental states would be different, obviously, but there's something similar going on.
Oh, very good. Now, you talk a bit about sentience in the first chapter. While I've got you here, can you clarify for me whether by sentience you simply mean capable of feeling comfort or discomfort, like pain or pleasure? Or does sentience in any way imply consciousness? Or are these two separate things, or can you have one without the other?
I think that sentience is really the same as consciousness, and I think consciousness is required to feel pleasure and pain. So if a being can feel pleasure and pain, I think it's conscious. It may not be self-conscious or self-aware, but it is conscious, because I think pain and pleasure are mental states. I don't think it's not just the firing of the nociceptors, it's the firing of the nociceptors in a way that connects with a brain
Right.
that has mental states. And I think that is true of many species of non-human animals, and all vertebrates and some invertebrates. So it's the self-awareness is more like what we were talking about before when I talked about humans thinking about their lives as biographical. They're aware of themselves as a separate entity from others, and perhaps with a past and a future. I think self-awareness may involve something like that. And I don't claim that all animals have self-awareness. I do think that in addition to normal humans, great apes, chimpanzees, orangutans, gorillas, elephants, dolphins, possibly dogs, and some other species would have that too, but not all the beings who can feel pain are self-aware.
Okay. You also mentioned many animals can feel pain, and there is no moral justification for treating their pain as less important than similar amounts of pain felt by humans. If we consider it wrong to inflict that much pain on a baby for no good reason, well, then we must, if we are to avoid speciesism, consider it equally wrong to inflict the same amount of pain on a horse for no good reason. So as philosophers, I'm going to give you a thought experiment. Okay. Given the choice by, say, a deranged killer to save a baby or a horse from enduring relatively equal amounts of pain, which would you choose and why? At that point, would you have to flip a coin or use some other form of randomization?
If we're assuming that this deranged person is going to inflict similar amounts of pain, but is not going to kill either of them, then yeah, I do think it's pretty random. You could choose either of them, and I wouldn't criticize you for saying you've chosen the horse rather than the baby. And I think to say automatically, oh, you must choose to prevent the baby suffering harm is speciesism, as I say, which is a bias in favor of our species,
right?
Which that term was invented to say there's something similar going on to what is going on with racism and sexism here. Not exactly the same, but a dominant group that is prejudiced against taking seriously the interests of a group over which it exercises power.
Yeah. Fair enough. I applaud your consistency, sir.
Thank you.
Yes.
As philosophers, we should think consistency is important.
You would think. You would think. Yes. It is the mother of all criteria. In the second chapter of the book, you talk about the use of animals as tools for research. I was quite surprised to learn about Harry Harlow's treatment of animals in this research. I remember as an undergrad reading about his findings, right, of the young separated monkeys from the mothers, right, and those favoring the cloth-covered, right, versions rather than the wire-framed versions, when left to be raised by mother surrogates, right? Harlow states sufficiently severe and enduring early isolation reduces these animals to a social, emotional level in which the primary social responsiveness is fear. To which I wrote in the margins, "No shit, Einstein." Pardon my profanity, but in retrospect, why do you think it took so long for behaviorism of this type to be seen for what it was?
I think it's the kind of white coat influence, the stuff that Milgram's famous experiments showed. People will obey somebody in a white coat who they think is, a scientist who's got some doctorates or PhD, whatever. And they will obey them even if they're telling them to give very severe electric shocks to somebody who they believe is in great agony. So, they will obey these people as well. They will go along with it. Their graduate students will go along with it. That's, this is the professor and this is the person who will write you a reference and help you get a job. That's the way they're trained. And so they will go on in that same model. And in fact, it really did continue far, far too long. It continued for maybe 50 years or something like that these kinds of experiments were done either by Harlow or by his graduate students who in turn became professors.
Yeah, I found it difficult and depressing to read so many accounts of abuses to lab experimental animals. You define yourself as a utilitarian, a person who believes in the greatest good for the greatest number. For the record, by the way, our oldest son is named Jeremy, and that's no small coincidence.
Oh, very nice.
We actually have a picture of him standing next to Bentham at UCL. So
Oh yeah,
I'll
right.
send you a picture.
I like that. I have a picture of me standing next to Bentham too, actually. I had the privilege of having dinner with Jeremy Bentham at University College London. It was a meeting of the International Society for Utilitarian Studies.
Right.
So they wheeled Jeremy
They
Bentham
wheeled
out
him down.
Glass case. For those listeners who aren't aware of this, this is a mummified body of Bentham with a kind of a wax head. Yes, he was sitting there during our dinner. He didn't contribute very much to the conversation, unfortunately.
That's okay. But they followed his will to the letter, which was nice.
I did, yes, that's right.
Can you imagine any scenarios in which the suffering of some animals could justify the ends that resulted from such treatments? For example, a major scientific breakthrough in medicine, a cure for a disease, right? If it were really possible to prevent harm to many by a single experiment that involves inflicting similar harm on just one animal, could we in any way justify that?
Well, I think we could, and I think as a utilitarian, that does follow from the position that if there is a major medical breakthrough that will help a very large number of people, or it could be a breakthrough in veterinary medicine that will help a very large number of animals to avoid suffering from a disease, I think you could do that. You would have to make sure, firstly, that there was no alternative way of discovering the knowledge that you're seeking, and secondly, that you were doing your utmost to reduce the suffering of the animal as far as is consistent with the achievement of the goal of the experiment.
Right.
So those would be very important conditions to place on that. But it's certainly at least theoretically possible that you could make such important gains for a larger number that you would be justified in inflicting some degree of suffering on the experimental non-human subjects.
Good point. In terms of thought experiments, can I get your response to the trolley problem? Has anybody ever asked you that?
A few times. Yes. So again, as a utilitarian, I think that you ought to be prepared to do what will end the life of one in order to save the lives of five. And so in the basic version of the trolley problem, where there's a runaway trolley that is heading down a track and will kill 5 people, and the only thing you can do to prevent it killing 5 people is to throw a switch, which will divert it down a side track where it will kill 1 person. I think you ought to throw the switch. And in fact, most people say you ought to throw the switch when they're asked that question. Something like 80%, I think, say you should throw the switch. There's another version where, again, there's a runaway trolley, but this time there's no switch. You're standing on a footbridge over the track, and there's, in one version, a stranger with a very heavy backpack on. And because they have this extremely heavy and solid backpack, and they're leaning over the edge of the footbridge looking towards the runaway trolley, if you give them a nudge, they're going to fall off the footbridge in front of the trolley, and they will be killed by the impact, but because of the heavy backpack, they will block the trolley, and the 5 people will again be saved. So some people say no to that, or a majority say no to that, even though a majority say yes to the switch. They have a different reaction to pushing the stranger with the heavy backpack off the bridge. But as a utilitarian, I think, again, it's really killing 1 to save 5. And I think you ought to do that in both cases.
Okay, fair enough. Now, you talk at some length about the disconnect between animal models and human subjects. That is to say, that what is discovered using animal models does not necessarily transfer well from one species to another. Another guest I have on the podcast is Dr. Charu Chandrasekhara. She's the founder and executive director of Canada's first and only center dedicated exclusively to alternatives to animal testing.
Yes, I know Dr.
Oh,
Chandrasekhar.
very good.
I met her at a conference at Niagara Falls, on the Canadian side of Niagara Falls, just
Excellent.
at the end of August.
Excellent. I was shocked to hear that, over 90% of the information we glean from these rodent models aren't transferable to humans. If we were, you know, why are so many labs then reluctant to change? Is it just this is the way we've always done things, so we're going to keep doing this? This is the only way we can get funding if we use animal models. What is the reasoning behind that?
I think it's in large part it is inertia. So it's inertia at different levels. There is inertia from the people doing the research, who, as you say, have been trained to do that and don't really know how to do other kinds of research. There is sometimes inertia from the regulators. So it's only quite recently that the United States Congress passed legislation authorizing the Food and Drug Administration to accept data, toxicity data, for example, of new drugs that does not come from animals, or to accept drugs without animal data. So often in many countries, regulators will still say, and maybe even despite this legislation, the FDA in the US is still going to be more confident about animal data because it's been using it for so long, and there'll be a bit of an uphill struggle, I think, to get it to accept some of the non-animal data. Yeah, I think it's absolutely clear that that's the way we should go. We should be developing a variety of different methods, cells grown in vitro, AI studies of what is likely. We can do AI screening of drugs. This conference in Niagara Falls, in fact, was about alternatives, and there were lots of scientists from many different areas, all looking at different ways of replacing animals by non-animal using models. And it was really positive and encouraging to see so many people. I think there were people from 40 different countries who are working on replacing animals, and confident of making progress, maybe not overnight progress, but confident that in the end we would be able to replace the use of live animals, which in any case, as you pointed out, is not very reliable at predicting human reactions.
Now, another person that I've had on the podcast, you might be familiar with. He was a professor of mine when I was doing my PhD at the University of Waterloo, Jan Narveson.
I knew Jan Narveson when I was a graduate student in Oxford. I think he was visiting Oxford or on leave.
Yeah. And now he disagrees with the notion of animal rights because he's a libertarian contractarian. And he says, because we can't have contracts between animals, they can't really voice their concern. They therefore don't have rights. What would you say to him? What would your response be to Jan?
Well, I would say to Jan, you've got the wrong ethical theory. You should go back to utilitarianism, which when I knew you, he was a utilitarian.
He was a utilitarian.
He wrote this book, Morality and Utility, which was an interesting utilitarian book. But taken more seriously, I would say the contractarian model doesn't really explain some of the things that we would want to have among humans either, right? For example, if you have humans who are also not capable of taking part in a contract or reciprocating, what status do they have? So if you have humans who have serious cognitive disabilities, should we use them in experiments, even harmful experiments to them, because they are also not people we can contract with? And an even bigger problem for that view is, what are we going to say about future generations? After all, we can't contract with them. There's nothing they can do for us. I'm assuming we're talking about people who are not going to exist until after we die. So there's nothing they can do for us. But everybody thinks that, they're people we should be concerned about. We should, it's one reason, not the only reason, why we should reduce greenhouse gas emissions, because of the very harmful effects they'll have on future generations. Of course, we can now see they're having harmful effects on us, and certainly will have harmful effects on our children. So we have those reasons too. But if you're talking about the long-range future, say disposing of nuclear waste from a nuclear power plant, I mean, if somebody said, well, we're not going to be alive in 100 years. We can't have contracts with people who will be around in 100 years. So why don't we just store this in containers that will last 100 years and then leak the radioactive waste into the ocean? That's not going to harm anyone with whom we can form a contract. So why not do it? But I think we ought to see that as wrong. And I think most people would see that as wrong.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, when you talk about factory farming, and you mentioned the numerous ways in which cows and chickens and pigs and other farm animals are abused before they are killed and packaged for sale, it was quite depressing to read about the extent of animal abuse that goes on every day throughout the world. My question then is, why don't more people know about these horrific circumstances? Is it a deliberate preventative act on behalf of the industry to keep the populace in the dark about this? Or if I'm going to play devil's advocate, have people ever accused you of cherry picking? Or is it, no, the data is the data and you can't deny those numbers?
Yeah, it's certainly not cherry picking because,
Mm.
If you take the description I give of how chickens are raised, right, as chickens being the most numerously factory farmed land animal. So what I describe is standard really throughout the industry. The special breeding of them so that they are enormously hungry and eat a lot and grow incredibly fast. The stress that puts on their legs, and there are experts in animal behavior and veterinary science from all over the world who will tell you about this because the systems are basically the same all over the world.
Mm-hmm.
So you can't cherry pick that. It's 99.9% of chicken production really is done like that. You ask why is it that people are sort of not aware of it? So I think it's partly that people don't want to know about it. I think people don't want to be disturbed about what they're eating. They don't want to have bad feelings about what they're eating. They don't want to change what they're eating. Some people do, but I'm talking again about the majority. Right. So they deliberately look away from something that they think will be unpleasant. And I've actually had people, say this line sort of, "Oh, don't tell me you'll spoil my dinner," is something that people really do say to you. And in a way, it's kind of shocking because, gee, if you think that if you knew about this, you wouldn't be eating these animals, then surely you know enough already to say, I better stop eating these animals, at least until I investigate whether what somebody has said about how they're raised is true. Right. And if you're not even prepared to investigate, then in a way you've already done what's wrong. That is, you're participating in something that you suspect is going to be really terrible, but you're continuing to do so because you're not willing to look at it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. When you mentioned that ethics, this is a great line. Ethics and compassion do not have to clash with economics. People like Les Sandel and Kathy Palmer founded How Now Dairy in Australia, where cows are treated much more humanely and still produce enough milk to turn a profit. Now, some will argue that this isn't a very realistic model when dealing with the demand for dairy consumption. As you mentioned, since the first edition of your book, worldwide consumption of meat has increased from 112 million tons to more than 300 million tons. A large part of that increase is due to the world's population having doubled in size during that period. And most of the rest is the result of an otherwise welcome reduction in poverty, especially in Asia. So then how would you respond to someone who would say that there are just too many people in the world to feed for models like theirs to work?
So I think for models like the How Now Dairy to work, we would have to consume fewer dairy products. That's right. True. I don't think you could produce the quantity of dairy that is being produced now without by those methods, because the cows are out on the fields, they have plenty of space, they even leave the calves with their mothers, which means that they drink some of the milk, so there's less milk for humans. And when you compare that with having 20,000 cows indoors in a huge barn and intensively fed, and yes, you can't produce the same quantities. But as I was saying before, we'd be better off if we ate fewer of these animal products, better off in our health and better off the planet's health and the environment, quite apart from the reduction in animal suffering. So I think it is possible to do that. If people really want to continue to have some animal products, it would be possible to produce them in humane and compassionate ways.
Right.
It's just that we would be eating a lot fewer of them, which in fact, humans have eaten a lot fewer animals, most of them, for basically all of human history. We haven't had the kind of quantities that we have now, and we could go back to that. And for those who really like meat and animal products, I suppose it would be more of a unusual treat that they would have it than something they have every day.
Right. You also state it's not tofu that's driving deforestation, but the meat and dairy industries. Clear cutting, slash and burn techniques of deforestation to make way for cattle. It's been going on for years, especially in places like Brazil. I had another guest on our podcast, Dr. Lenore Newman. She's the director of food and agriculture at the University of the Fraser Valley. She's a Canada Research Chair in Food Security and Environment. She claimed in terms of meeting the demands for protein and dairy, there's some fairly novel forms of tech going on out there, like, this kind of meat in a vat production and yeast manipulated milk. So she envisions a day when major factory farms are replaced with this kind of artificial development of different types of protein and dairy. So it's very interesting. My concern, and I'd like to pick your brain on this, just as the oil sector is going to be disrupted when new, more sustainable forms of energy are discovered and put into place, how should we be thinking about those in the agriculture sector who are going to be affected when these new forms of agriculture, you know what I mean? The transition period. How do we take care of them?
There will be a difficult transition period. Yes, obviously, the new forms of producing food and protein is also going to create new forms of employment. There will be people who have to work in those places. But the traditional farmers will be losing markets. I think that's inevitable. It's difficult to say over what time period, but especially if we're talking about things like the dairy industry, where cows, again, like beef cattle, are major emitters of greenhouse gases. I think it is a good thing for the planet, even apart from, even if the animals are quite well treated, it's still a good thing for the planet to reduce or eliminate the dairy herd as well as the beef cattle. So those people are going to have to find other places to work, and that's, I think, that the disruption of a variety of industries, as you say, you mentioned the coming disruption of the oil industry when you get new forms of clean energy, but AI is going to be another huge disruption that is replacing, or already starting to replace, people in some areas of work. So I think there's a huge social question there as to what are we going to do? We will become more productive. We will be able to produce things more easily and more cheaply, but will the benefits of that be distributed to everybody, as some people have proposed, through a universal basic income that everybody gets enough to live on? Or will they go predominantly to the capitalists who've invested in these processes? That's something that government policies can play a big role in. But even if there is a universal basic income, there's still a question of what purpose people are going to have in their lives, because humans have always been purposive creatures. We had to have the purpose of finding enough food and protecting ourselves against predators and reproducing. If in fact our jobs are no longer necessary because machines are doing it for us, I don't think we want people just to sit in the sofa all day and watch Netflix series. We need to develop some other purposes, maybe creative and artistic purposes. We would hope, but something that people will both enjoy and find meaningful and fulfilling.
Very good. You describe how conscientious omnivores oppose factory farming, but continue to eat animal products from farmers who treat their animals well. I've been able to be one such. conscientious omnivore. And within our family, my brother-in-law opened up a place where we were able to purchase chicken that was not from a factory farm. But does this not create a further delineation between kind of the haves and the have-nots? That is to say, people can afford that type of meat, will go out and can ease their conscience about eating meat, but the majority of the world, they can't. So they're going to have to eat this factory farmed meat. Do you see any issue with the imbalance of
There are
wealth?
certainly good questions there as to how we will handle that. Of course, a lot of the poorer people in the world are living rurally anyway, so they could have a few chickens running around their land if they have some farmland, and that's what people have traditionally done and still do in some places. Maybe even some pigs eating scraps, and those animals could have good lives and could be humanely slaughtered. So they would get some of that, but the poorer urban dwellers would be more of a problem. I agree. So what I hope will happen is that, in fact, the sort of new technology of food that you mentioned, producing both meat and dairy products without using animals, will eventually scale up to the point where those products become sufficiently cheap to be affordable by everyone. Right. But I must admit, we're a long way away from that at the moment, so I can't predict when that will come about.
Okay. And you mentioned, among other influences, there's a predominant Judeo-Christian influence regarding the species' treatment of animals. Being told that humans are given dominion over all the animals of the earth, humans have an easier time mistreating, killing, and eating the flesh of animals because God gives it the big thumbs up. With the rise of fewer religious people in the world, in fact, it's the fastest growing phenomenon now. I think we're at about 20%. And the gradual decline in religious thinking. Are you hopeful that the future will look better regarding the mistreatment of animals, at least from that perspective?
Yes, I am hopeful. I think the rise of secular thinking is definitely welcome, because traditional religions tend to have prejudices. Certainly, many of them do against animals. The Christian tradition does, but also against women, against people with non-standard sexual orientations. So, yeah, I am hopeful that as the number of secular people on the planet grow, we will have better and essentially we will have progress in the kinds of lines that a utilitarian would hope for. That is, we will take account of the interests of all sentient beings, and we will try to further them as best we can.
Good. You mentioned about Darwin effectively demonstrating our common lineage with all other living creatures. And you state the fact of our common evolution with other animals overthrows practically every earlier justification of our supreme place in creation and our dominion over the animals. How then do, if those who believe in evolutionary theory and understand what our place is amongst the evolutionary chain of beings on this planet, but 4/5 of the world's population doesn't necessarily buy into that, how do you suggest we have that conversation with them?
It's going to be a slow process. Obviously, we can, because in a way you have conversations face to face, one person at a time. Now maybe we have ways of reaching larger audiences. The audience for your podcast is larger than that, and sometimes things get across to many millions of people. But actually getting them to change their views is often a slow process. So I don't have any shortcuts to that. I think we have to talk about this as much as possible, talk about thinking clearly and rationally, looking for evidence for our beliefs, not just accepting something on faith. So I definitely am hopeful that that is changing, and that approach is eventually going to win out. But yeah, I don't have any timeline by which this is going to become the dominant view on the planet.
Yeah, yeah. Now, if as paleoanthropologists maintain it was the omnivorous habits of our ancestors which led to fat-rich diets, which greatly led to the encephalization of our brains, could we say that it was somehow maybe less wrong to eat meat during our caveman hunter-gatherer years than it is today?
Oh, certainly. I think that when we were struggling to nourish ourselves and our children, it's you can't blame people for eating whatever they could to get enough calories and to remain reasonably fit and strong for the kind of arduous lifestyle that many people had in those times. So even today, I would not blame people who are living a traditional hunter-gatherer lifestyle. That's their choice. I don't think it's up to us living affluent, comfortable lives to say you should stop doing this, at least not while we, in the sense of the populations that we live in, the societies that we live in as a whole, are doing much worse things to animals than they are. So I think we should clean up our own backyard or our own factory farms. And when we've done that and can say, okay, now we're treating animals well, maybe you could try to reduce the amount of suffering you inflict on them, even if you're going to live traditionally and still end up hunting and killing. Just think about ways of reducing the suffering of the animals who you do kill.
Mm-hmm. I found it very interesting, and I was quite impressed when you said, why, for instance, is the hunter who shoots a deer for venison subject to more criticism than the person who buys a ham at the supermarket? If the hunter can shoot well enough to kill the deer quickly, it will be the intensively reared pig who has suffered more. So it would appear that the default logic here is just to avoid, really, we're all about causing less suffering and harm to animals. But if it's going to happen, to do it in the most humane way.
Yeah, that's right. And I think, as I said, the deer shooter who kills the deer with a single bullet through the brain, preferably, is not really causing pain or suffering to the deer. They are killing the deer. Mm-hmm. And you could say, well, the deer could have continued to live, but in some parts of the country, and I'm actually living in a part of the United States now, where there are no predators for deer. There are no wolves, there are no indigenous people, so there are no other predators. I should say there are no other predators than licensed hunters.
Yeah.
And if some deer are not killed, then the deer will populate to the point at which population will be controlled by starvation, probably in winter.
Yeah.
And as I say, a hunter who puts a bullet through the brain of a deer is causing that deer a less painful death than a death by starvation.
Right. My last question about animal liberation now, I'm going to quote from Albert Schweitzer's book, Reverence for Life.
Yep.
Schweitzer said, a man is really ethical only when he obeys the constraint laid on him to help all life which he is able to succor, and when he goes out of his way to avoid injuring anything living. He does not ask how far this or that life deserves sympathy as valuable in itself, nor how far it is capable of feeling. To him, life as such is sacred. He shatters no ice crystal that sparkles in the sun, tears no leaf from its tree, breaks off no flower, and is careful not to crush any insect as he walks. He's not afraid of being laughed at as sentimental. It is indeed the fate of every truth to be an object of ridicule when it is first acclaimed. Today, it is considered as exaggeration to proclaim constant respect for every form of life as being the serious demand of a rational ethic. But the time is coming when people will be amazed that the human race was so long before it recognized thoughtless injury to life as incompatible with real ethics. Ethics is, in its unqualified form, extended responsibility with regard to everything that has life. Schweitzer believed a new renaissance was coming, which would allow people to better understand the close ties that we have with every other living thing on the planet and their ethical duties that arise towards those other living things. Do you think we're on the verge of a new renaissance in this regard?
No, unfortunately not. Certainly not the kind of renaissance that Schweitzer is talking about,
Right.
which is based on life itself. It's really quite a strange passage. I do discuss that passage with my students because firstly, it's explicitly talking about life, all life, which includes plants. And secondly, there's that little bit that you read about shattering the ice crystal. The ice crystal is not a form of life, right? So what is exactly wrong with shattering the ice crystal, even on an ethic of reverence for life, right? So that's one problem. But the other problem is we can't live without taking life, right?
Right.
I know there are some people who try to be fruitarians, so they will only eat what is, if you like, the fruit of the plant and not harm the plant. So you pick the apple off the tree, and some of them would say, well, when the wheat plant is ready to harvest and let its grains fall, you can pick the grains and so on. So you could survive, but you couldn't eat a lettuce or a cabbage. You don't want to let that flower and go to seed, or carrots. So I think when Schweitzer says, we shouldn't ask anything about the quality of the life, I think that's wrong. I think we should ask the crucial question: is this a conscious being? Is this a being who can feel pain? And if the answer to that is no, this is a carrot and carrots can't feel pain, then there's nothing wrong in ending the life of that carrot, which you do when you pull it out of the soil, chop it up and put it in your salad. So, I think that's really too broad an ethic. I certainly want to broaden our ethic to include all sentient beings, but I don't want to broaden it to include all living things. And I don't think, it's quite a while. It must be more than a century, I think, since Schweitzer wrote that passage.
That's right. Yep.
And I don't see any signs of that particular ethic of reverence for life really spreading in the world today.
Right. Right. Well, let's switch gears and talk about different life forms like artificial life. In regards to AI, you stated when robots become conscious, when they also, like humans and animals, become capable of suffering or of enjoying their lives, they certainly should have rights. The current work we're doing at Convergence Analysis, basically, one of the topics that comes up, of course, is that of consciousness. Have you given any thought to how we might determine the emergence of such a property in AI? Like, is there a Blade Runner Voight-Kampff type of test? Is there an ultimate Turing test for this sort of thing?
I've given some thought to it, and I've also talked with other people who've given a lot more thought of it about it. In fact, we had a 2-day conference at the beginning of October in Princeton on AI, conscious machines, and animals. And day 1 was about AI and conscious machines, and day 2 was essentially about AI and animals and the impact that AI is already having on large numbers of animals. But people, if they want to look at that, can go online to the website of the University Center for Human Values at Princeton and can listen to the tapes of that. But there are people at that conference who thought more about this than I have. Nick Bostrom from Oxford, for example, was one. Jeff Sebo from New York University. Quite a few people. Harry Shevlin. Quite a few others, philosophers who've thought about this. And I don't think we really were able to reach a conclusion. I should mention Kristen Andrews, who's a Canadian philosopher at York, and is concerned about which animals are sentient, as well as the possibility of sentient AI. So yeah, everybody said, the Turing test has really been thrown out the window because you can already these large language models, the chatbot 4.0, for example, GPT chat, sorry, I should say 4.0, is pretty close to passing the Turing test. It's very hard to tell whether you're chatting with that or with a human who is typing out at the other end, except that I guess ChatGPT is a lot faster, so you would need to slow down ChatGPT so that it could really fool you that it wasn't a human. So I don't think that test is going to work. I think we're going to have to try in a way to look under the lid and see what the programming is that is producing this result. That's not going to be easy to do because increasingly it's AI that is doing the program writing. So it's a bit of a black box. It's not clear that we will be able to decipher what's going on. So it's a serious problem, I think, as to how we will be able to tell whether an AI is genuinely conscious or is a unconscious machine programmed to mimic the reactions of a conscious being.
Let's say it somehow emerges as it did with us, right? Consciousness emerges.
Yep.
Are we gifting them or are we damning them?
That depends how we treat them.
Right.
I mean, if we just treat them as slaves to serve our purposes, we're damning them, I think. But if we treat them then as sentient beings with interests of their own, and it can, take into consideration those interests as we would similar interests of ours, then perhaps we're gifting them life and gifting them a positive life.
And what would happen if a conscious AI didn't care how it was treated? Does it still have rights irrespective of that? Does it, right? So it says,
it
don't
really
worry,
doesn't
guys.
care if it doesn't even have preferences, right? Because certainly you could say, well, you could imagine a conscious AI that doesn't feel pain or pleasure, that isn't conscious in that sense. But does it have preferences about anything, or is it really just completely indifferent, right, to what happens to it? If it's really indifferent, then in one sense I would say, okay, it's conscious, so it has moral status, equal consideration of interests, but it has no interest in anything, right? It has no interest in wanting outcome A rather than outcome B. And so there's nothing to consider. And even if you give it equal consideration of nothing still amounts to nothing.
Yeah, right.
And if it really, that's a strange case. It's hard for me to imagine a being who's conscious and doesn't have preferences for one outcome rather than another. But if that's the hypothesis, then I think you can't treat it well or badly.
Yeah.
Makes no difference.
Now, of the different ways in which AI is being used to optimize, say, factory farming features, have there been any any uses of AI that reduce the suffering of animals in this?
Well, this is somewhat controversial because there are some companies producing AI which say things like, we will detect diseases earlier than humans will, and then you can go and do something about them. Or we will provide optimum food level for the animals. But the question is, this is an enterprise being run for profit, not for the welfare of the animals. So what are the owners going to want the AI to do? So in terms of optimum food, they're going to want to reduce expenditure of wasted food. But the AI might inform them that they can actually leave the animals a bit hungry and still produce the same amount of profits, in which case that's probably what they'll do. I mean, in terms of the disease detection, which certainly sounds like a benefit to the animals, the owners may say, oh, now that we can detect these diseases, we can stock them more densely than we did before. So they'll be even more crowded than they are now. And maybe that crowding will cause them further suffering, even if, because of the disease detection, they don't actually die from it.
Okay. I've got another hypothetical question for you here in regards to AI. So we now experience ANI, or a narrow form of AI, your Roomba and Siri and maybe autonomous cars and things like that. But AGI and ASI, where artificial intelligence becomes super intelligent, more intelligent than humans and can far exceed our capacity for thinking. Here's the question for you. If we could create an ASI which would solve many of the cruel atrocities brought against factory farmed animals, but there was a 5% chance that we might not be able to control it, should we still proceed?
So the question really is whether this super intelligent AI is going to be benevolent and want to produce a better world, And even if we don't control it, it still will produce a better world in which our interests will get taken into account. They might sometimes be outweighed by the interests of non-human animals or by the interests of AI. But that would still be a good outcome, I think. So I would not want to not go ahead with this superintelligence because we might lose control of it. But that would only be something that I would want to do if we can be extremely confident that it is operating on these benevolent values. That is, that it's not, something that goes crazy and causes immense suffering to both human and non-human sentient animals, and maybe to other AI systems who are also conscious. Who knows? And obviously, it's going to be difficult to be confident that the values are properly aligned. So there is a real grounds for concern about superintelligent AI being smarter than us, but not having our values, or not having even, I'd like it to have better values than us, really, not having that either, but having worse values. And for that, yes, it's good that there are people thinking about how to try and prevent this, although whether they'll be able to succeed in that certainly is very much up in the air at the moment.
It is. All right, let's finish off with just a couple of human interest questions. You mentioned I think in a Twitter post that you had tried meat in a vat for the first time. What was that like?
Yeah, they didn't call it meat in a vat; they called it cultured meat.
Cultured meat.
But yes, it was grown in a bioreactor, I think. It was pieces of chicken that I had in Singapore, which was the first country to allow the sale of cellular meat. Look, it was interesting to see how you could produce the texture and some of the flavor of chicken. That was it was a novelty. I enjoyed eating it, but it's not something that I feel, I really want to have more of that.
Right.
I'm perfectly happy with the various plant-based foods that I think are tasty and delicious, and many of them more delicious than the chicken pieces that I had.
Right. Do you think it's going to be a game changer in the future? Can people tell the difference?
So I was eating it together with Julian Savulescu, who's a philosopher in Singapore, now partly based in Singapore, and he still does eat chicken. I think it's a shame that he does, but he does. And he said it's not quite there yet. He thought, I mean, it was okay, but it was not the best chicken that he'd eaten. And to change the game, it's going to have to be as good as the best and competitive in price. And it's not that either. So I think there's a way to go.
But we are heading in that direction, it seems, right?
Slowly. There are some skeptics who think we won't get to that point, certainly not on cost. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of money going into it, and I think these investors must have carefully looked at the prospects of getting some return on their investment.
For sure.
So they may turn out to be wrong, but I wouldn't bet on them being wrong. I think we may get there.
Yeah. Final question: in your entire career, did you ever face any pushback or threats from Big Agra?
Not threats, really, no. Pushback, yes, of course. A lot of them, and they still do sort of try to oppose what I'm saying. Right from the start, when I published the first edition of Animal Liberation, they attempted to ridicule the arguments of the book. So yes, they certainly push back, but to their credit, they haven't gone out and hired the hitman yet, and of course I hope they never will.
It's funny you're saying that to an Italian from Guelph. It resonates quite well.
Right.
Listen, I want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to talk to me today. I
Thank you.
very much appreciate
the conversation. It was good to talk to you.
Yeah, I'll be sure to send along a picture of my son next to Bentham.
Oh yeah, do that. Yeah. And of course, let me know when the podcast will go to air, and we'll do some social media around it.
Of course. Well, thanks again.
Okay. Good to talk to you.